Spirit of Thersites here. I'm trying a new program which can only record for 15 minutes at a time, and that should be useful since I'm trying to get the average length of videos on this channel to about 10 to 15 minutes if possible. So let me know what you think of that format. I was quite disappointed to learn, although not at all surprised, that the Democrats decided not to go ahead with the $15 minimum wage in the COVID relief package. 8 different Democrats voted against it, and in due time we will look at all 8 of them and decide whether or not they are indeed worthy of a primary challenge. My initial gut instinct is to say yes, but it's a little more complicated than that, so we'll look at it when we get there. In the meantime, I'd like to highlight a couple of other things that are brought up by this Politico article before we get to the 8 senators. Bernie is saying that progressives will continue to bring this issue up until it passes. That, of course, is a heartening thing to hear. Bernie has been mostly fairly quiet since the Biden administration took office, and now he's just finally starting to emerge. I suppose it does take a little while to get used to being budget chair, so it's good to see that Bernie is still around. That being said, that 32 million number, I'm glad that he brought that up. Those are only the people who would be directly affected so far as I can tell, but what is not included in the 32 million number is that there are a lot of people who are, say, just above $15. So if all the minimum wage workers and people who are above the minimum but below 15 get pushed up, then that helps a whole lot of other people, and it has an upward push all across the wage spectrum. So it actually is more important than just raising the wages of the people at the very bottom. It raises the ceiling, or excuse me, the floor for everyone, and will have a positive impact. A lot of time, actually, in recent years, the number of people making the literal minimum wage has gone down simply because the minimum wage is so fucking low that a lot of companies, including big companies who are deeply anti-union, have actually raised their own minimum wages higher than the minimum required by state and federal officials. So that's why the numbers, if you looked at just the people who work for the literal minimum wage, have been going down over time. It's not so much some general increase in wages, simply that even companies who are completely ruthless no longer think that it's justifiable to have the minimum wage be what it is. Let's look at something down here real fast. So here, the Politico people, who are always big fans of bipartisanship, seem to think that the Democrats will have to work with the Republicans to get this done and make some sort of a compromise. The problem is that the Republican proposal, as put forward by Romney and others, is to raise minimum wage to $10 over the next 5 years, and then index it to inflation. Kyle Kulinski thinks that this would take the minimum wage completely off the table. I think that his instincts are generally right on that, but not 100%. The issue would still be capable of being raised, would be much harder, and a lot of people who are above the minimum wage line would scoff at it and say, aren't those guys already getting a raise? What are they complaining about? So I think that he's generally right on that, and it would effectively allow the Republicans to pretend to act on a popular issue because people really want the minimum wage raised, and do just enough to prevent large-scale social unrest from getting worse, while still protecting their corporate masters by keeping wages way lower than they should be. So to compromise with the Republicans is not to make a good deal and give your constituents something rather than nothing. It is to simply abandon them. There is no middle ground to be had on the issue of the minimum wage. Either you are for a $15 minimum wage or you are not. That is all there is to it. Any compromise defeats the point of trying to create a living wage. Now let's get to the not-so-great 8, the 8 Democratic senators who decided, in their infinite wisdom, to vote against a $15 minimum wage. Manchin and Sinema were pretty much givens on this list, so it does surprise me that the other 6 joined them. Until I looked at their records, and then it actually became kind of clear in some cases why they did. Let us start, and then go through them in the order that they're listed here. First up is Joe Manchin of West Virginia. The same Joe Manchin who spent the last 4 years humiliating himself before the feet of Donald Trump, even though widespread reports say that after Manchin would go up to Trump and kiss the ring, Trump would then mock him for being a little bitch. Manchin voted with Trump more than half the time, and Trump still basically called him a borderline communist and tried to get someone elected in his place. So yeah, that was some really manful stuff, especially from a guy who usually runs ads where he literally shoots bills with hunting rifles. Of course, Manchin famously represents a state where labor abuse and poverty are rampant, and it's really hard to justify West Virginia poverty given that West Virginia is one of the most naturally wealthy states in the country, just if you look at their mineral wealth. The problem is the political structures of West Virginia. There's plenty of wealth to go around, it just needs to be distributed in a just way. And in terms of labor protections, miners often are not given the best safety precautions or workplace protections, one. And two, when there are mine collapses, a lot of times the bosses have way more control over relief operations than they should. The state rarely, if ever, intervenes. One famous mine collapse saw the owner of the mine, whose workers were trapped, refuse to allow a rescue team that was unionized come in because he was afraid that they would contaminate his workplace with union ideas. And the miners died. So anyway, yes, West Virginia is in desperate need of higher wages to give workers more power vis-a-vis their bosses. It is a literal life and death issue. Joe Manchin will be up for election in 2024. And of all the people on this list, he is easily the most useless. There's never been a point in his career where he's done anything all that worthy of note. He adds nothing to the Democratic Party. Losing him would be trivial. He would just be a number. That's his only value. Jon Tester of Montana. The best way to describe Jon Tester is that he is more or less a basic Democrat, except that he is an outright and total whore to the banking industry. In 2018, he became the first Democrat ever to be endorsed by Friends of Traditional Banking, which is a group that wants to do away with all or most banking regulation, and they typically endorse anti-regulation Republicans. So he is so libertarian on banking that if you asked him what the ideal banking system would be, he would just say 1928. He also is a big fan of fracking. Every time I say fracking and then fan together, I usually conflate them somehow, but he is a fan of fracking. He got an A- from the NRA, which is a very high mark for Democrats. The NRA, by the way, is a branch of the Republican Party for all practical intents and purposes, but sometimes they will throw a big bone to a super conservative Democrat, although apparently there's another organization called Gun Owners of America, which doesn't understand how to pretend to be objective or issue-based, and they gave him an F, because he's got a D after his name. But they're objective. They're just about guns, not just about party labels, of course. Interesting thing about Jon Tester, he butchers his own meat in Montana and flies it to D.C. That must be an awkward-ass plane ride when he's sitting next to somebody with a package of wrapped meat. Fucking weird. Anyway, we can send him home. I don't know what year he's up, but it's probably either 22 or 24. So if you are in Montana and you're a progressive, go out and run against this motherfucker. Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, one of the older members of Congress, or at least she's up there. She's in her late 70s. She's been in politics since probably the 1970s. Honestly, of the people on this list, she might be just about the best. Her voting record is mostly good on most issues, and it has been over the course of her very long career. The main things she's got going against her are that she does have corporate donors. She obviously voted against raising the minimum wage here, and she also is getting up there in age. Some of her donors include Microsoft, Comcast Corporation, BAE Systems, and Capital Group, which is a professional lobbyist firm which takes corporate money and then gets congresspeople to do corporate stuff by hiring a bunch of staffers who know the congresspeople. So, yes. Also, one of her big donors, which again was Capital Group, if you look at who they gave their donations to, they gave a little more to Democrats than Republicans, but that's because the number one person they contributed to in 2020 was Joe Biden. The second place went to the National Republican Congressional Committee, and third place was the GOP Senate Leadership Fund. So basically, this group is very conservative, and by backing Jeanne Shaheen, they're indicating that they feel comfortable with her, that she is a safely pro-corporate Democrat. Well, if they're safe with her, we shouldn't be. We can send her home. She's had a good long career. Time to go back to New Hampshire and eat some applesauce. Kristen Sinema from Arizona. Here is a tale of tragedy. She was once a social worker. Apparently she grew up homeless, or at least perceived homelessness or something, maybe home insecure would be a better term. And she had a lot of passion early in life, and that slowly drained out of her. She became a lawyer later. She taught business law. She got a PhD in justice studies, which apparently is a program which does not include any consideration of class. She forgot about her background unless she wants to whine about it. In 2000, she was a Nader supporter, and she was actually an activist for his campaign. She wrote some op-ed against capitalism in 2002, then she joined the Democrats in 2004, and by 2012 she was a full sellout who refused to run against other Democrats or in any way oppose them. Now she is one of the main Democrats who's a big supporter of the Chamber of Commerce. Actually, by 2014, she was one of only 5 Democrats in the country who was endorsed by the Chamber of Commerce as a House candidate, which tells you everything you need to know about where her priorities are. So, yes, she is someone who needs to go. Also, she's someone completely devoid of substance. I won't go into the chocolate cake incident, but suffice it to say that she says that anyone who commented on her demeanor, meaning the flippant attitude and thumbs up and delivering a chocolate cake, or her attire, is a sexist. Not that we're in the middle of a pandemic where over 500,000 people have died, and a bunch of assholes like Ron Johnson are delaying the voting, and then assholes like her are preventing a minimum wage increase, which would lift people out of poverty. None of that matters. If you have a problem with what she did, you're just a sexist and you have character flaws, okay? So, there you go. Next up is Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, another New Hampshire senator, and then we'll have 2 Delaware senators in a row. It's almost as if sometimes when you get a deep blue state, you would think you would get a reliably blue senator, but it actually is just some corporate fuckwit. So anyway, Maggie Hassan is a political scion of the aforementioned Jeanne Shaheen. She won in 2016 over Kelly Ayotte by a mere 1,000 votes. You can tell she's not a very good candidate. This also means she'll be up in 2022, and she's very vulnerable. She was a corporate defense attorney, and then she was handpicked by Jeanne Shaheen, which, so far as I can tell, after a cursory glance at Shaheen's career, might have been the worst move she made. She had 2 staffers in 2019 who got ultra heated over the Kavanaugh hearings, hacked some computers, leaked a bunch of personal information about 5 Republican senators, and were convicted and jailed for their crimes. So she runs a tight shop and is clearly a great leader. As governor of New Hampshire, she was for medical marijuana, but then did her best to prevent legalized marijuana more broadly. So there are several reasons to get rid of her right there. 2022 is the year. Let's get that done. Next up is Chris Coons of Delaware, someone who also had a fall from grace. At one point, he was a student in Kenya. He was a volunteer relief worker during a crisis. He then worked at the Coalition for the Homeless. In 2010, he defeated Christine O'Donnell in a 2010 special election. She was a semi-famous anti-masturbation activist who famously said on national television in an ad, "I am not a witch." I'm not making this shit up. He co-sponsored the Israel Anti-Boycott Act in 2017, which would give up to 20 years in prison for anyone who dared to boycott Israel or endorse a boycott of Israel. That in itself is enough. He's also super pro-free trade, and he proposed the Stronger Patents Act, which would make it even harder for things to go into the public domain and for generic drugs to be made. Corporate tool, let's get his ass out of there. Next up is Tom Carper of Delaware. He was a Navy veteran recruited by the Democrats. He then got into bed with the Republicans. As governor of Delaware, he governed as a new Democrat, quote-unquote. He's a huge supporter of charter schools. He wants to limit class action lawsuits. He wants to restrict personal bankruptcy. So basically, he is the true heir of Joe Biden, and he is the true heir of the credit card mantle. He is also into the debt ceiling, just a complete piece of shit. He'll be up in 2024. He's also old. He was born in the 1940s. Last, and possibly least deserving of a primary challenger, Angus King of Maine. He's an independent. He was governor in the 90s. Most of his work is good, except he's always been shit on wages. As governor, he actually vetoed a 25-cent increase in the minimum wage, and he's only interested in healthcare reform if it's along a bipartisan basis. There, I did it. 15 minutes.